In his book, A History of Reading, Alberto Manguel weaves his own experience of reading into his history of books. Unlike Manguel's account of learning to read, I struggle to remember how I learned to read at all. He can recall a specific moment when he realized he could read. And for me, there's no clarity in my memories. In my head it goes more like this: I couldn't read, then one day I could. My parents have no idea either. When I asked my mother, she told me that she would read to me often when I was younger. She always made a point to ask me about the book she was reading out loud, asking me to point out things in the illustrations, and later, when I was learning to read, she would ask me to point out the different words. I remember that she tried to teach me to read using Hooked on Phonics, but I remember just spinning around in circles on the floor while she tried to get me to focus. And then one day, I could read. I don't know how old I was, but I know that I read before a lot of my classmates and my cousins because I remember watching them struggle with words that I already knew. I don't really know if my reading had any relationship to my writing. My parents told me that I could type before I could write, or so they say. When we learned how to write in school, I was always frustrated by how slow it was to write letters by hand, and I found that typing was a much faster way to express my thoughts. I assumed that reading and writing went hand in hand in the sense that as I read more, I became better at writing. I was always writing, though. Some people smuggle books into boring classes. I smuggled in journals. I loved to do creative writing projects in school, and I always wanted a way to express myself. Even when I was very young, before I could read, I remember dictating stories to my mother so she could type them for me. Whenever I struggled with teenage angst in high school, which was all the time, I turned to writing instead of books for my escape. I found a lot of books were too optimistic for my tastes and preferred writing, where I could fine-tune things to be as depressing as I wanted them to be. Even now, I have to be constantly writing. I annotate passive-aggressively when I'm trying to read, because things get boring when they aren't about me. I can only read someone else's self-expression for so long before I'm obligated to include my own. I often appear completely psychotic, finding lines at the bottom of pages that just read, "Shut up, shut up, shut up!" My way of silently commanding someone in a class to stop answering something incorrectly. Writing, however, unlike reading, has no way to gauge one's goodness. So despite my constant writing, I always assure myself I'm a better reader than I am writer. My parents and teachers realized I was good at reading when I had to take a standardized test in 2nd grade, and my reading scores were in the highest percentile. Most things for children my age were too easy to read, and I grew bored of them quickly or would get frustrated by the simplicity. It was a challenge for my parents to find things that were age-appropriate, but challenging and interesting enough to read. I remember in 2nd grade, the teacher had this bin of books we could pick from every week, and we would take the books home to read. It had some very formal name, I'm sure, as everything in schools involving reading does. Sustained silent reading, or independent reading rotation, never just reading. I told my teacher I wanted something challenging to read, and she gave me a book called No the Seal. The cover depicted white fuzzy seals smiling on icebergs. I was of course excited to read the book. I loved animals, and I liked to watch seals at the zoo. When I got home and started to read it, I soon discovered something disturbing. The book was about a young seal that gets sexually molested by his uncle and learns to tell the adult seals how he was touched in his no-no places. I'm sure books like this are very useful and important for children who have been abused, but it was very unsettling for a child with no knowledge of this sort of thing, and raises the question, why was the book in a random bin and not in the counselor's office? My mother was, of course, upset and concerned. She worried that I would now fear my uncles and seals alike. Permanently traumatized by the fact that her daughter learned about sexual molestation at the hands of seals, she closely monitored what I read. She often would read books before she would give them to me. I remember spending hours in bookstores while she skimmed through books trying to find something at my reading level, which, when I was in elementary school, I think was around the high school level. So it was really hard to find things that were appropriate and were about things that I liked. One of my favorite books was The Dragon Slayers by Bruce Coville. If I remember correctly, it was about a princess who dresses up like a boy and goes out slaying dragons and adventuring, which was awesome, quite frankly. I sometimes felt isolated, not by my choice to read often, but because I could read faster and more accurately than my peers. Although I'm not sure when I first could read, I know that I was reading chapter books at least by 2nd grade, silently and on my own. After the No the Seal incident, my 2nd grade teacher let me a copy of Stuart Little to read, which I was able to do by myself. Reading, though, was such a status symbol in elementary school. A lot of times adults or teachers didn't believe that I was really reading and just assumed that I was skimming and saying I had read it. However, many of them came around when standardized test results came back that proved I could comprehend what I read. Teachers often accused me of lying about my reading speed as well, which made me feel like there was something wrong with me, personally. There was one instance in 3rd grade when I was asked how long it would take me to read 20 pages of a book. I wrote down 30 minutes and brought it up to the teacher to turn in. She became angry and told me that it was a bad answer and that I should have put down that it takes me an hour. When I tried explaining to her that I really could read that fast, she just shook her head and said no, despite my protests. I felt so embarrassed that she thought I was lying. I always wanted to impress my teachers, and I assumed she disliked me for lying about my reading. On a similar note, Manguel writes about how most readers have encountered negative comments due to their antisocial, inactive hobby. I can't remember anything like that happening to me. My family all read books often, and it was always a part of our lives. I think a lot of this stems from my grandfather. He never completed high school, but he educated himself with books. It was shocking to people when they found out he never finished high school because he was so knowledgeable about so many different things. His bedroom was full of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, with everything from poetry to encyclopedias. He taught my mother to cherish books, to take care of them, and never throw them away. He mostly read nonfiction, or as he called it, nunfiction, because he felt that it was important to understand real life before you spend your free time reading stories. I think that the importance he placed on books really impacted my mother, and I was always encouraged to read by everyone in my family. Because of my grandfather, I knew that you could gain so much from books. My whole life, I always heard comments about how smart and special I was for spending my time reading, which encouraged me to continue. Reading was just normal for my family, and they never made a big deal out of it. They read all the time, I read all the time, no issues. Other things that were not normal in my family, of course, were watching foreign films. Why don't you go out and do something tonight instead of sitting around on the couch? Playing video games? It's such a nice day. Why don't you go ride your bike? Take the dogs for a walk. It was only when I got older that I realized most of my friends and extended family didn't read in their free time. Even in college, I was shocked when I found out my current boyfriend reads. I just got to the point where I didn't expect that from people anymore. Even though it was rare for me to find other readers, I was never made fun of that I knew of, or felt isolated because of reading as an interest. What I have found can be isolating is my choice in books. I often tell myself I should read the classics, but I have no idea what this means. I preloaded my ebook reader with a lot of public domain classics like Jane Austen, but I never have the will to read them. Some of my friends who don't even like reading have read more classic literature than I have. Reading a book like A History of Reading makes me feel like a bad reader because I'm so unfamiliar with so many famous texts that they reference. Of course, I've read a good amount as an English major, but in my free time, I stay far away from them. Even in high school and college, I never set out to educate myself with books that I thought might be important. I just read what was entertaining, what grabbed my interest when it was on a bookshelf, be it Blindness or Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. I just read. There's a short story by the Chicago author Audrey Niffenegger called The Night Bookmobile. It's about a woman who stumbles upon a bookmobile that contains everything she has ever read, from her childhood books to letters people sent. If the Night Bookmobile was real, I'm not sure I'd need one, or if I'd want to see everything in one place at one time. I wouldn't find volumes of Charlotte Bronte or Tolstoy. I'd find huge collections of Goosebumps books from when I was a kid, and wishbone versions of classic novels. I'd find annotated versions of Dostoevsky and Hawthorne, right next to signed copies of every novel by Augustin Burroughs. Chuck Palahniuk, sharing shelf space with Franz Kafka, The Omnivore's Dilemma, wedged next to Nick Cave. If I wanted to, I could walk into my basement and find copies of every book from my childhood. It's comforting to know that they're there, and while I don't want to lay them all out and reminisce, I don't want to get rid of them either. Reading has always just been a part of my life. I've never thought about it or planned it. I still go to bookstores and I just browse at random, making my selection based on the cover of the book, or if it involves drug addicts or drag queens in any way. My mother told me once that she used to say I read books like some people eat potato chips. It's a habit, a reflex, something I do with no real awareness that I'm doing it. That's why I never identified as a reader, because it's such a huge part of my life that it never struck me to name it.